When people talk about risky decisions, they often describe something dramatic, whether it was a warning that was ignored or a corner that was cut or just someone being careless. But the more I think about situations I've seen and been part of, the less that explanation holds up because it's rarely dramatic. It's usually much quieter than that. It's usually we're in a room looking at something that makes sense and the opportunity is real and the commercial case is credible and no one in there is behaving irresponsibly. Yes, things are tight, but if I'm being honest, in growing organizations, things are almost always tight. So that doesn't necessarily feel unusual. And then someone in the room mentions capacity, not as an alarm, but as a reality. And there is a small pause, and that's not awkward, it's just thoughtful. And you can feel everyone doing that internal calculation. And the question in the room subtly shifts because it's no longer, is this risky? But it's, can we do this? Can we carry it? And then when somebody calmly says, we'll manage, well, that doesn't sound reckless, it sounds steady. Because most of the time, we probably can manage, or at least for a little bit anyway. And that's the part that really complicates things. When nothing breaks immediately, the decision feels validated. And once something feels validated, even if it is just temporarily, it resets our sense of what is acceptable. And I've recognized that dynamic in myself as well, that quiet negotiation between caution and momentum. It doesn't feel like choosing exposure. It feels like choosing stability because sometimes it even feels like protecting the business. Slowing down, well, that feels like it can introduce uncertainty, whereas pushing on can feel decisive. And in that moment, it's decisiveness that carries the weight. So we move forward, not blindly and not arrogantly, just reasonably. Over time, though, something subtle happens. What once would have prompted a harder pause starts to feel workable. The same level of strain that once raised an eyebrow, well, that now feels like pace. And it isn't that the risk has disappeared, it's that the tolerance has adjusted. And that adjustment rarely announces itself. It happens in small and little increments. One decision that holds, another decision that works out, another that feels contained, until, well, the operating line has shifted further than anyone quite intended. And what I find most uncomfortable about this isn't the eventual failure, it's how normal it all feels while it's happening. Because there's no villain, there's no villain in the room, there's no obvious negligence, just intelligent people that are navigating pressure. Commercial pressure, that has a way of reshaping judgment without anyone really noticing. When growth targets, they stretch, when margins tighten, when expectations rise, the instinct is always to adapt. We just absorb a little bit more strain. We rely on competence and we trust experience. And yes, often that works. And then that just reinforces the instinct. And experience adds another layer to this. When you've made difficult calls before and they've paid off, confidence rightly grows. That confidence is earned, it's not misplaced. But confidence can narrow doubt. And doubt, uncomfortable as it is often what slows escalation early. The more certain a room feels, well, the harder it becomes to introduce any friction. Not because dissent is banned, but because momentum feels coherent. And from a board perspective, but this becomes even harder to see because what reaches the board, that's already interpreted. It's already contextualized. It's already been framed as reasonable. Performance may still look strong. Reports, well, they may still support the direction. And unless someone is willing to gently test the story underneath the numbers, then the gradual shift in tolerance, that can remain invisible. So the question isn't whether leadership understands risk, it's whether anyone is interrogating how the narrative around that risk is evolving. And that's a different discipline. It requires stepping back from the logic of the moment and just quietly asking, at what point would we decide differently? And we need to ask that before pressure peaks, because once momentum builds, well, stopping feels heavier than continuing. And I don't think this is about intelligence. If anything, it's often the most capable leaders who are the most persuasive, both to others and to themselves. Risk rarely arrives loudly. It arrives wrapped neatly in reason. And reason, when it's commercially sound and backed by experience, it can be very difficult to challenge that. Which is why I don't think the real issue is reckless leadership. It's unexamined rationalisation. It's the moment when justification begins to replace scrutiny. And that moment rarely feels dramatic. It just feels, well, it feels a little bit like progress. And sometimes that's exactly how it is described. You hear it all the time in organizations. It's described as progress because the business is growing, the team is delivering, and those markets, well, yes, they are responding. On the surface, everything reinforces the decision, which makes it very difficult for somebody to say, let's pause. Because that pause, well, that can look like doubt. And doubt at a senior level isn't always comfortable to display. Then again, I've noticed that in myself too. There's a subtle pressure, particularly when people are looking for you to be the one that's certain. They're looking to you for certainty, to hold the line, to project steadiness, and to avoid creating unnecessary turbulence. And most of the time, that instinct does serve you well. But occasionally, it means you absorb strain that perhaps you should have examined it a little bit more closely. And this isn't about leaders ignoring warning signs. It's about leaders reframing them. A signal that once would have prompted a deeper dive becomes something to monitor. A hesitation becomes something to, let's just keep an eye on it. Language, well, the language softens, and softened language, that reduces perceived urgency. And that shift rarely feels significant in the moment. It feels proportionate, especially when there are other pressures at play. Let's think about investor expectations, competitive positioning. We've got those delivery milestones to meet and a reputation to maintain as well. None of those pressures are imaginary. They are all very real, I assure you. And they shape judgment in real time, which is why I struggle with overly simplistic narratives about corporate failure. It's rarely just one bad call. It's a sequence of reasonable calls made under pressure that collectively move the line. And because each one is defensible, there's no obvious point in which to stop, in which to pause, in which to intervene, until hindsight makes the pattern clear. And I sometimes wonder whether the real discipline in leadership isn't about making those bolder decisions, but about noticing when the internal justification feels just that little bit too smooth, when there's no friction in the room, when everybody's nodding that little bit too quickly, and when the risks are described in increasingly softer language. That's often the moment that I think really deserves the attention. And I'm not, saying that it's because disaster is imminent, but it's when we should be thinking tolerance might be shifting. And once tolerance shifts, systems adjust around it. People, they start working harder. Buffers shrink. Workarounds become normal, and capacity is getting stretched, even quietly. It's still getting stretched. And again, none of that is dramatic, but it does change the operating environment. And from a governance perspective, that's difficult terrain because performance may still be strong. The dashboard may still look healthy, and the narrative may still be coherent, which means the work becomes less about spotting obvious failure and more about gently challenging whether the story still holds under stress. And not in a confrontational way, just in an honest one. What would have to happen for us to reconsider this? Where are we assuming resilience rather than testing it? Have we redefined manageable without really noticing? Those are not, I promise you, those are not aggressive questions. But I admit they can feel uncomfortable ones. And discomfort is often where recalibration begins. I don't think this is about becoming risk averse. Businesses need momentum. Businesses need confidence. They need leaders who are willing to move. But movement without periodic pause can become drift. And as we've seen, drift doesn't announce itself. It feels like continuity, which is why I think the most important leadership discipline isn't simply decisiveness. It's the ability to step back from your own reasoning and ask whether it's still serving you or is it supporting you? Because sometimes the most intelligent leaders aren't undone by ignorance. They're undone by conviction that was never re-examined. And that re-examination rarely happens naturally. We have to force it. It has to be chosen.